I'm Andy. True Blue Quilts is an online store where I share my quilt patterns. I also have a long arm service, um, and I am also a quilting teacher, and I'm working on some online classes, so I hope to have those available very, very soon. But today we are going to look at Sue's BQ, and I'm going to tell you a stitch story looking at the designs I used in her quilt. So Sue chose the pattern BQ, published by Maple Island Quilts, and it's a really beautiful design for showcasing those fabulous fabrics and the prints that you don't want to cut up into tiny pieces. You can see from the graphic nature here, it really has a modern feel. And Sue made this quilt for her son. So as we were talking about the quilting, I knew we needed to keep it more masculine. I love to quilt feathers, but a lot of times, you know, especially for guys, you don't want to go quite that frilly with the quilting designs. So here is what I've come up with. In those green fabrics, the fabric itself had these little squares. You can see the shininess, that was part of the print. And I wanted to highlight some of that, and also with the graphic squares and rectangles in the quilt pattern also. That really guided my decision making. So I started from the left here with a square meander, and I just stitched across the area and turned at right angles, back and forth, across the lines, you know, going around and around. So that gives you just a different feel, a more angular feel to your meander. So that was in one of the green rectangles. I also kept those right angles going with this design called Skyline. And for this design, I was thinking of obviously a city landscape. Some buildings are taller, some shorter. So so the skyline pattern there, just make, you know, drop down below, kind of keep your midline in mind as the horizon, and make some of the buildings taller and shorter as you travel across the quilt. The next design I called Monster Teeth, and I'm traveling along the edges of this block, and I just did some wavy lines, came to a point, stitched back, stitched down the seam about an inch or so, and continued. And I made my teeth a little more than halfway across, and then I left gaps in there. And then as I filled in the other side of the block, I would make the points extend into that gap that I had left from the other side. So that was an easy way to fill up that space. And these rectangles, just because of the way I loaded the quilt onto my machine, they were tall and skinny rather than horizontal, but all these designs could be rotated 90 degrees with no problem. And then the beads, I've really started to enjoy this pattern. I've used it on several quilts, just starting from wet edge and traveling along pretty much a straight line, but do some spirals or concentric circles there, and then move about an inch to 2 inches away. And with the rows, I tried to alternate the spacing of those circles as I went across the rows here of those beads there to give a circular feel. A lot of times you'll want to use circular designs in the quilting if there's a lot of straight lines in the piecing, and vice versa. If you've got some pieced areas, if you've got circles, you may want to fill them in with straight lines just to give that extra interest in the quilt, make people look a little bit longer. Okay, here's another design on the left, sine waves, and I'm doing these oval shapes in 2 passes. So I would travel across the quilt one direction and then just reverse it. So since I ended this on a hill, I need to start with the valley and then I crossed. And luckily this print had those nice graphic areas that I could anchor my crossing, and trying to keep that spacing around the motif of the quilt even. Obviously, some areas I'm more successful than others in making those curves and those waves symmetrical. But that's the beauty of handmade. Nothing's ever going to be exactly the same. And then this second line of stitching, I just took the same idea of a small sine wave and just really shrunk it down. So I'm just barely wobbling the needle up and down as I move across. And then as I come back, I get a little bit bigger, offset the wave a little bit to make that more interesting design there on a small scale with those sine waves. And the figure 8, this loop pattern is very easy to stitch and very versatile. You can make these loops a bit smaller if you're working in a small border area. As you see here, I was really filling up the space. So these are like 3 to 4 inches wide there as I go around. This space right here is only about maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches, but this horizontal distance is 3 to 4 inches. So you can make your loops really big to fill up the space, or make them smaller. Long, skinny loops, you would get more loops filled in there. Okay, there were a couple more pieces with those same fabrics, so I wanted to change it up a little bit. On the wavy grid, again, I used the intersection of the print as my guideline, and I just did a slight wavy line there in one direction, and then came back and made sure I crossed all those sections there. That gives the quilt a very nice texture. The worms idea is taking your meandering stitch and just elongating it. I'm going more at right angles here to fill in and kind of worm my way around the fabric and outline and things. So thinking of tall cactus rather than short little alien fingers that you may see in smaller meandering. Worms just takes that basic meander stipple and really makes it long and skinny as you wave back and forth there to fill up the space. On this leaf fabric, I used a design called Hills. So I just start with like a foundation line here. You can see it stands out a little bit more because I've traveled along that line of stitching a little bit, and I just run parallel lines for a little while, and then I make another foundation line perpendicular and start echoing that. So you can see some of these lines are running downhill from left to right, and some of the stitching lines then run uphill. So you're creating that texture by having your lines go in different directions across the space. And then this design here called Flame Flower. This is one of my favorite designs. I love just making that kind of S curve and then echoing it, kind of gives you a flame point. They are similar to the monster teeth design that I used earlier. But to turn that flame stitch into a flower, I just start with a spiral in the center, and then as I come out of that spiral, I go into my first flame shaped petal and work my way around, and then can do a single wavy line off the edge. And so I did these flowers in alternating directions. The print is very busy, obviously, so the stitching is not the focal point of that, but it kind of mimics the fabric flowers that you see there in kind of the petal shape. So I'm always drawing inspiration from my fabrics. This seagrass meander stitch, I started just with this little kind of dewdrop. I think Leah Day called it dewdrops. Just a little raindrop there on the end of your stem, I drew it here on a whiteboard since it's really difficult to see here in the fabric. But kind of make a hook around, make your little dewdrop, and then branch off in a different direction and just meander all the way across your whole quilt there. Makes a very fun design, feather-ish without being so intricate. So some of the other spaces in the quilt that I was working with here, you can see the design on the front of the quilt and then this lovely gray background. This gray that you see in this square, I did a triangle fan. So this is done with a ruler, starting obviously at one corner and just extending that center one. I always stitch the center fan blade first and then fill in the sides there for that very strong geometric, not geographic, that's maps and things, but geometric, strong geometric feel to that. And then in this black sashing here, I just did rows of pebbles. And when I stitch pebbles, I go all the way around one time. So I'd start here and come around, and then when I get to this point, I'm gonna come the other way so the thread doesn't always build up on one side. I'm going to come around once and a half, and back around 1.5 times, come the other direction. And here you can see I needed to escape out into the border where I needed to stitch in the ditch and outline all my blocks. So I have done that depending on what color thread I was using. I was using a light green there for some of the rectangular free motion stitching, and then black for these borders. And then my pebbles get a little bit different size as I'm just eyeballing the spacing there as I approach these corners. I knew I wanted to turn the corner, so I needed to make this one just a little bit smaller there to get around that corner. And then classic E's and L's. This is a great, kind of handwriting exercise that you can stitch. And here I was going in 2 different directions, up and down, as I went across the quilt. And some final tips there. We've looked at all the designs. Just, you may notice these straight lines. I just did a wavy parallel line there in that one section next to the gray square across this white area, and this border area around the large rectangles have those E's and L's. So the white and black, those were my simple background fill. Pebbles, wavy lines. I just kept that consistent through the whole quilt. And then in the larger rectangles, obviously I showed you how I played with those different free motion designs. And you can adapt your designs to fill the space. You can do smaller loops in the smaller areas, as I was talking about with the figure 8s. You could make your flowers big or small. You can make the triangle fan smaller, give it more blades, and just let the fabric inspire you when you are quilting. So that is today's stitch story. You can find more quilt ideas. I have a Free Motion Monday blog series that you can find at True Blue Quilts. I hope you have a lovely day with whatever you're stitching. Thanks very much for spending some time with me. If you have any comments, leave them in the down below the video, and I will get back to you with some answers or for some ideas. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I will see you next time on True Blue Quilts.